Good evening all, and welcome. Living near others can be a blessing and a curse, depending on who you're living by, of course. Tonight we're going to be delving into neighborhood land with my good friend, Deadly Cure. When you're done here, be sure to follow me over to his channel to check out some of his work. He is an exceptionally talented narrator, as I'm sure you will find out by the end of the video. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. When I was in my early 20s and living in Chicago, I wasn't making much money. When I found this apartment, it was too good to be true. The top floor of a duplex with 6 rooms for $775 a month. The agent who showed me the apartment stressed it to me that the landlords were very religious. I didn't have a problem with that, even if it did sound ominous. The landlords were an elderly couple that lived downstairs. They seemed okay at first. When I saw them in the yard, they'd smile at me. I took good care of the house. Then, when they saw I was having my boyfriend over, things really started to get weird. One day I was in my office writing when I heard a knock at the door. I open it, and it's the old lady from downstairs. Before I can say hello, she says to me, "Have you ever gotten an abortion?" I shut the door in her face. No thanks. This was a colossal mistake. The house was laid out kind of weird. There was a door at the bottom of a flight of stairs that I thought led to a communal laundry room. But after accidentally opening it once, I discovered it led directly into my landlord's living room. And I learned this the hard way. I was in my kitchen cooking. My boyfriend was at work and I was by myself when I heard what sounded like the click of a door. "Okay," I say out loud. "What the hell was that?" I really didn't make the connection. It could have been the door that led to their living room. I walk into their hallway and look around. I didn't see anyone at the end of the hallway, and I poke my head into all the rooms and no one's there. Then I look down the staircase leading into their house, and the neighbor lady is standing there staring at me. I scream. She flinched and stepped back into her apartment and swung the door shut. After that, every time I left the house, and I spent every possible moment out of the house after the incident, I would come back and something would have been moved. A window would be shut. Once the shower was dripping and my towel was damp. I couldn't lock the door because since it was technically a door to their house, they were the ones with the key. The knocking got so frequent, 3 to 4 times a day, that me and my boyfriend propped up an old mattress so that we wouldn't hear it while we slept. The second to last straw was when I opened the door for work and the stairs were gone. I physically could not leave my house because there were no stairs. They had been dismantled and were sitting on their porch. I called them repeatedly, but they didn't answer. Finally, their son came out of the house and explained that they were remodeling their porch. He told me that I had to cut through their apartment downstairs. I descended the stairs and opened the door, and they were both sitting at their filthy kitchen table staring. The phone was in the cradle. They must have heard it. They kept staring at me with this blank look on their face. I crossed their kitchen and left from the back door. A few days later, I came home from my job and noticed the bathroom floor was almost completely flooded, like someone had left the faucet on or the shower on. The old woman, seeing that I had come home, came upstairs and knocked, screamed at me that I had flooded the bathroom and that her son had come to fix it. I was so run down at this point that I told her it was okay. Her son comes by a few hours later and he is stupid drunk. I open the door and tell him that I need an hour or so before he comes, and he picks something up and swings it at me. It was a massive wrench. I somehow duck out of the way and he stumbles over, and I book it down the narrowly repaired stairs as quickly as possible and call the cops. They come by and take down a complaint, but claim since there was no physical contact they couldn't do anything. I later learnt that the old couple has a daughter on the force. In the middle of the night, me, my boyfriend, and several of his friends packed all of our stuff into a Chevy Astro. We lived in hotels in the van for a month, until we found another house. They never attempted to contact us again.
To give you some context, this occurred roughly 14 years ago when I was 12 years old and living in East Side Australian rainforest. When I say rainforest, our house was on a 40-acre property surrounded by bush. The house itself was owned by a Swiss man named Hans. Occasionally, he would come down with his tractor and slash the long grass surrounding our house so we could access slightly more of the property in the summer. It was also extremely handy, because if you know anything about Australia, it's that we have tons of beasties that can very easily kill you. We lived about a 40-minute drive from the small town centre. This meant that if we needed groceries, medical attention, or to contact our parents, say while we were at school, it would be a 40-minute drive before anything could be done. The house sat on the side of a large mountain, roughly 3/4 of the way up, so naturally most of the land we called home was strewn with valleys, nooks and hideaways. We had trails we could walk, and they led to a stream and a small waterfall with about a 6 or 7 meter drop. It was a truly beautiful place, but considerably scary to me and my small siblings, one brother and one sister slightly younger than me. We knew our neighbours on both sides of the property, but because the location of our house was pretty remote, our nearest neighbours were roughly a 10-minute drive away. One was a lovely lady who used to wave to us when we got off the school bus before we made the trek to our house every day. I think our parents asked for her to keep an eye on us. The other was a middle-aged man and his family. He was a real jerk who excavated around the bottom border where our properties met and continuously interrupted the stream and waterfall's clear-flowing water supply. Lots of strange and creepy stuff happens when you're living in the middle of nowhere, but one in particular involved a guy I certainly don't want to meet again. Being pretty removed from people, it was extremely rare that we ever got visitors we didn't know were coming. When people we didn't recognize turned up, it was usually because they were lost and needed directions. One day though, a man in a ute came roaring down our driveway. I remember running inside to tell my dad someone weird was here. He immediately walked outside to see who this unwanted guest was. A little background about my dad. He is literally the most hardcore person you will ever meet. He has one leg after having it amputated earlier in his life after having an accident on a motorcycle while he was running from the police. He was in the Navy and was brought up in a very strict household. He had grown up in a very rough part of Sydney's west, so he had some pretty shady contacts too. In short, he is someone you really wouldn't want to mess with. I wouldn't be surprised if he had killed someone in his life prior to having kids. Anyway, my dad goes outside to see what all the commotion is about, while my mum keeps us inside, being protective. The man has a large red furred dog in the back of his car that looks like a German Shepherd cross. It snarled at my dad, but immediately cowered when the stranger told it to shut up. Our own dog, Millie, renowned beast killer just for the record, was snarling and going ballistic whilst being chained up to the house. "Hi, my name is John." The way the man spoke was like he was a salesman, a really slick and smooth guy who on the outside seemed friendly, but with the overtone of wanting something. My dad immediately responded with, "So what the hell are you doing here then, John?" The man was taken aback, obviously not used to dealing with someone as hostile as my dad. They then talked for a while, and I could hear my dad talking with a sense of confusion about whatever the man had to say. I did, however, overhear my dad say, "What the hell are you thinking? Just call the cops." I found out later that the lovely old lady next to us had died. Apparently, John was on the other side of her property and went to visit and found her dead. He also asked my dad if they should move the body to make it, quote, easier for police to investigate. This is obviously why my dad was telling the man to call the police immediately. Anyway, later that night the police showed up to take a statement from my dad and John, who was hanging around at our house until the police arrived. I remember my dad pulling an officer aside and explaining that John wanted to move the body when he first arrived. By the way, the reason I know all this is from asking my mother at the time and my father some years later. The police left without any more questions, as it looked like she had died from natural causes. John was still at our house. I found him to be a very unsettling person. The way he smiled, the dark of his eyes. He was unfamiliar, but acting like he was one of us. I remember it was a school night, and I was trying to watch TV, and he was playing songs on his guitar with my mum and dad at the table. I was angry because he was ruining my shows, and I told Mum I wanted him to go, and that I thought he was weird. She smiled and told me she felt the same, and told me I should go to bed. The next day, things seemed normal. Went to school, came home. Not seeing the familiar, friendly face of the old woman stung a bit on my way past her house. It felt strange, and I hoped that she knew her family loved her before she passed. I was a bit sad on the walk home, until halfway down the driveway, I noticed John's ute again, parked out the front of our house. I walked closer, and was greeted by his dog, Rusty. He walked outside with my dad, and I heard him call Rusty to his car as he was leaving. Apparently, he was borrowing tools from my dad. He left and waved goodbye, like he was someone I was going to miss. Again, that sense of over-familiarity made me feel uncomfortable. I didn't know this man. I didn't like this man, and I was hoping he would never come down our driveway again. My dad then pulled me aside and asked me what I thought of John. I labelled him a weirdo, and told my dad I was hoping he wouldn't come back. For the second night in a row, when John returned Dad's tools, he was sitting in our house playing guitar and annoying everyone. My mum and dad were visibly unimpressed by the situation. I heard them arguing about him hanging around until eventually my dad told him he needed to leave as it was time for us to go to bed. He insisted it was early and tried to make an excuse to stay. I found that very odd. I was polite enough to know when someone didn't want me around, so why didn't this man? Or if he did know, why wouldn't he leave? After ushering him out, my mum and dad had a big talk in their room, and my dad told us all he didn't like John, and that he was going to ask him not to come over anymore, and if we saw John again, immediately tell him. The next day was a Saturday, so we were going to blow up our cheap inflatable pool and go for a swim as it was getting pretty warm. Around 11 AM, the sound of a car thundering down the driveway alerts me and I go outside. I run back inside to tell my dad that John is back. Just like the first time I ever laid eyes on John, my dad goes outside and we stay inside with my mum, watching and listening through the screen door. John, again with his weird, overfamiliar smile and dark eyes, greets my dad and is met with, "Look mate, I don't know who you think you are, but I don't want you coming around here anymore. You scare my kids and my wife, and I don't want you to come back. You understand?" I didn't hear John's reply, but from his tone, it sounded like he was confused and tried to reason with my dad. Dad wasn't having it and told him to go or he would call the cops. As he was leaving, Dad said, "Don't come back or you'll be sorry." This is where things truly get weird. As my dad lays this subtle threat on the man, his face completely changes to one of rage. He glares at us in the house, sticks his finger up, and speeds out on the driveway, spouting profanities and churning up gravel, spraying it towards our house. My dad came back and told us we wouldn't be seeing John anymore, and if we did, we were going to call the police. I was relieved. This odd man made me feel uncomfortable in my own home, and the way he reacted when he left confirmed the feeling I got from him when I first saw him. I can't remember if it was the Sunday or the Monday after that day, But John did come back. He tried to reason with my dad and say sorry for whatever caused us to not like him. Before he even got out of the ute, my dad said, "If you don't turn around and leave, I'm gonna smash your face in." He did just that. My dad then called the police to inform them of what happened. Apparently, they were going to go and talk to John. I didn't hear any more of what happened in that conversation. A few weeks went by with no sightings or happenings with John, and we all felt like things were back to normal. This was until our mailbox had been tipped out of the ground and smashed, or possibly run over. I remember asking my dad what happened, but he wasn't about to give me any ideas. He later told me that he knew it was John after the way their last conversation ended. The next weekend, after the mailbox incident, we went into town to get groceries and a fast food dinner as a bit of a treat. And when we came home down the driveway, my dad immediately stopped my mum from proceeding and said that something was wrong. Next to the carport where we parked our car at the back of the house, there was a window that opened to the bathroom. My dad must have spotted the window was missing. As we drove down, he got increasingly more tense until we all noticed the window was missing. I remember being confused in the back seat, not really knowing what was going on, until I saw it. A man, dark eyes, overfamiliar, coming from the window that led to the shower. My dad was exploding with rage. He told my mum to rush down the driveway so we could mess this guy up. The man proceeded to escape the window and run down the back of our property into thick lantana, a really thorny shrub-like plant. My dad, only having one leg, let Millie loose as she was going ballistic tied up to the house. She raced down the lantana-engulfed hill into the darkness. She came back with nothing. My dad went out with his flashlight and couldn't find anything either. I'm not sure if anyone slept that night. None of our possessions had been stolen or even moved. We must have caught this man just as he was entering our house. The police came the next day and searched for fingerprints to no avail. My father was furious and again alerted them to John and his strange behavior. They told us they would look into it once again. That was the last time we heard from John that year. I had almost completely forgotten about him and had the summer off to enjoy myself and get ready for high school. The school I went to was pretty large considering where we were, but everyone seemed to know each other pretty well, including the teaching staff. Within my first week at school, we were introduced to all the teachers and teaching aides. I was caught completely unaware when that over-familiar, dark-eyed man from the previous year was introduced as a teacher aide. Except instead of John, he was introduced as Gregory something. I went into a little bit of a spin as I was trying to make sense of it all. I was 100% sure this man named Greg something was the same man who introduced himself to my family as John. At that moment, so many things rushed into my head. What if he killed the old lady? What if he didn't live close by? What if he wanted to move the body so he could frame my dad? If he lied about something as crucial as his name, what else was he lying about? What if police never even made contact with him? I was sitting there for a good 10 minutes, trying to piece it together until the teacher called my name to bring me back to reality. That is when he noticed me. The look on his face when he saw mine was one I'll never forget. He immediately recognized me. He looked shocked. His eyes were wide, and he said nothing, just staring. I had just found out his dirty little secret. I could sense that he was now the one feeling uncomfortable and on edge. Later that day, I rushed home to tell my dad who I had found. He was shocked and repeatedly asked was I sure. He went to the school the next day and discovered the man had put in for indefinite leave yesterday and might not return. When we learned of the news, my dad told me to watch out and let him know should John or Greg ever return. So John, Greg, whoever you are, let's not meet again. Update. My family got together for Christmas Day, and I showed the story to my dad to have him read it and see if it brought back anything. He told me that John once followed him into town and on foot to a doctor's appointment, but stopped when Dad entered the doctor's. He also told me he considered killing him if he came back to the house, and that he also suspected the old lady, Mrs. Quidgley, had possibly been killed by John. Apparently, she has a bit of a backstory too, according to Dad. She was a barrister that helped criminals avoid conviction. Possibly a further connection to John, but yeah.
I had just moved out of a share house in the suburbs and into my own crappy one-bedroom apartment in the city. I am a male, and at the time was around 25 years old. My apartment, while old and small, was located about 500 meters from one of the most popular night spots in the inner city. As I was in my mid-20s and out on my own, this was the perfect place for me. This was because my friends and I were quite social and would frequent bars and nightclubs in the city, and the taxi fares were starting to add up. Also, this new apartment was close to my work, so the move made sense. I got settled in right away and invited my friends over for pre-drinks before hitting the clubs. Due to the limited space in the apartment, this means that some friends were inside and some were drinking on the walkway just out front. We had the music up and had just started drinking, but between songs I could hear the couple next door arguing. Now the apartment was old and crappy, which meant thin walls as well, so I pressed an ear to the wall in order to listen. I hadn't met any of my new neighbors at the time, as I didn't take too long in moving in, and I didn't see anyone during. I was curious. Judging from what I could determine while eavesdropping, there were a gay couple in their early 30s. One of the men was yelling at the other to go next door and tell us to keep it down. The other was arguing that it was just a housewarming and to let it go for the night. Since I didn't want to cause too much trouble, I marshaled everyone outside to start making our way to the club, leaving my new neighbors in peace. Later that night, I came home alone as I was tired from the move and decided to let my friends carry on partying without me. I arrived at my door and proceeded to fumble around for my keys, when I looked up to see a man standing on the walkway in front of the next door apartment smoking a cigarette. He was tall and thin with brown, oily hair. I noticed that he had a cut lip and a faded but still visible black eye. "Good day," I said. "Sorry about the noise earlier," correctly assuming he was my neighbor. He replied, "Nah, you're right, mate. I'm Chris," and he shook my hand. I noticed his knuckles were red and a little bit scratched up, so I knew something was off. I apologized for the noise and said, "I hope I didn't cause any trouble for you." He withdrew his hand with a soft but cracking voice and said, "Nah, it's all right. Rick just gets a bit cranky sometimes, I'm used to it." With that, I finished off the conversation and told Chris that I'd see him later. It was about 2 a.m. at this point, and I just wanted to sleep, but couldn't help worrying about the potential domestic abuse going on next door. I decided to keep an eye on it for now, as I didn't have all the info. For all I knew, he could have gotten into a fight with someone else. As the weeks passed, I noticed that my new neighbors got drunk regularly and would argue almost every time. I could tell that Rick was the dominant one, as his voice was a lot deeper and Chris seemed to be afraid of him during their shouting matches. This is why I kept my distance and never really socialized with them. I would even overhear them arguing about me, and that Rick thought that Chris liked me, etc. I would just tune out all of this with headphones and video games, not to mention an active social life and full-time work to keep me occupied. I did find myself avoiding having guests over because of the neighbors. I would opt to meet people out, as their arguments would be quite upsetting. This was working out fine enough until Christmas Eve that year. I was arriving home after having come from some last-minute Christmas shopping. I was getting ready for a night of present wrapping as I was to visit my family the following day for Christmas. As I arrive home, I noticed 2 police cars outside and Anna, an Asian woman who lived a few apartments up from Chris, screaming. I asked her what happened, and all she said was, "It's just so sad," while sobbing. I could see 3 officers trying to restrain someone, and there was blood on their uniform. I came just a little bit closer to see Chris's oily brown hair in the center of the affray. His face was bleeding from his jaw where he had apparently been slashed by something sharp. They got him to his feet, and I could see that his cheek had been cut so deep the skin was flapping open as he struggled and resisted with the police. I recoiled in shock, and I went to comfort Anna, who was crying uncontrollably at this point. Suddenly, Rick's voice boomed out of nowhere. "You see what you've done? You loser, just kill yourself." This frightened me, and my instinct was to get me and Anna to safety. Even though the cops were here, they had their hands full with Chris, and I certainly didn't want to get involved in such an ugly fight where knives were involved. Anna refused to come with me and said she would be fine. I looked around to see where Rick was, and he kept yelling at Chris the whole time. The 3 cops struggled to restrain him, and I could hear Chris whimpering apologetically in between. I couldn't see where Rick was, so I decided to just go to my apartment and lock the door. As I turned to go, I froze, as Rick's voice boomed, "Where do you think you're going?" A chill went down my spine as my brain struggled to reconcile the fact that these words were coming from Chris's mouth. I felt panic grip me as I realized that all this time Rick and Chris were the same person. All the fighting, laughing, drinking, and carry on that I couldn't help overhearing the last couple of months had come from one solitary person, a lonely guy in his small 1-bedroom apartment. For some reason, this made me feel sick. I later learned from Anna that this wasn't the first time the police had come out to take Chris away. Anna explained that he spends a few months at the local psychiatric hospital each time. His father owned the apartment, so it was here waiting for him when he got out. I moved out a few months later, and while it's a sad situation for Chris, I really do feel for him.
This is something that happened to my family when I was a little girl, back in the mid to late 1980s. When my dad retired from the Marine Corps in the late 70s, he took an engineering and consulting job with a major defense contracting corporation based out of Salt Lake City. I have one older sister, my mum, and just me. My sister and I were formally raised as Catholics from a very early age. I remember going to Mass as soon as I could read and write. Utah, as it is well known in the United States, is basically central headquarters of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, aka the Mormons. I apologize in advance to any Mormons if I get some terminology wrong or anything like that. I've read some church publications for curiosity's sake, but that was a long time ago. My sister and I both went to the same elementary school, while both of my parents worked during the day. I was a bit of a shy kid and kept to myself, but I always loved and still love going outside for long periods of time. There was a family living next door to us that had a lot of children. Though none of them went to our school, it's my understanding that large families are common among mainstream Mormons, especially so in Utah. Our houses were divided by a wooden plank fence that had a few gaps here and there between them. I remember that if I wasn't careful, I'd get pretty nasty splinters from it. Sometimes the kids, 2 boys and a girl my age, would climb over the fence to play in our yard with me and my older sister, but they never stuck around terribly long, despite having a blast. A lot of the time, I could hear their mother yell something at them when they came over. Then they'd have to go home. I didn't think anything of it at the time, my mum would often yell for me to come inside too. Every single time they'd hop the fence to come and play, in about an hour, sometimes less, a woman would shout for them to get back home immediately. One day while they were over, my mum brought us a plate of apple slices and cheese as a snack. Sure enough, after we ate, the woman yelled loudly for the kids to come back home right away. And so they did. I came inside not too long afterwards, eating dinner with my family later that evening. While we were eating, there was an emphatic banging at the door. My father got up to see what was up and told my mother to keep me and my sister in our seats. Turns out, the man banging on the door was the father of the family next door. Apparently, the kids are on some kind of restricted diet that we had no way of knowing about, and he was very angry when he learned that we had fed them without consulting him first. I don't remember the rest of the conversation exactly, but I do remember hearing my dad, a 6-foot ex-Marine, originally from Brooklyn, swearing a whole awful lot, followed by the door being slammed shut. The dude huffed off, and that was the only time I ever actually saw this guy. It didn't occur to me until about 5 years ago why this would be so unusual and kind of messed up. After that night, the kids weren't allowed to come over and play anymore. We would say hi to each other through the gaps in the wooden fence. We would just talk as long as we could, since apparently they were now afraid of coming into our backyard again. All of this over apples and cheese, I thought, and especially since at Sunday school they taught us about how Jesus wanted people to share with one another. We thought we were just being nice. Same as always, a saggy-looking middle-aged woman would yell at them to get inside their house if they were seen talking to my sister and me. Sometimes they didn't even say goodbye, they just ran. I was too young to understand what was up, and when I told my parents about our little fence meetings, I think they were worried. Over time, there were more and more young children among them. I remember seeing them play outside with a couple of toddlers later on. Eventually, the style of their clothes would change from what you'd expect a young child of the neon decade to be wearing, to low-key button shirts, blue jeans, and the girls only wore dresses from there on out. I had schoolmates with strict parents, sure, but not that strict. At the time, I thought maybe they were super-duper grounded for doing something bad, and that's why they couldn't come over anymore. Sure enough, every time they were seen hanging out near the fence, a woman would start yelling at them, and they'd have to bolt. Sometimes, though, I swear it would be a different middle-aged woman yelling for them to come inside every so often. This upset me, and I told my mum how sad I was for them. But looking back, I don't think there was anything even they could have done. The last time I saw any of those kids, it was the girl, my age, waving to me through the gap in the fence to come over. She said that her family had to move, that they were all going to a ranch in a place called Arizona, and that they probably wouldn't be back. Of course it made me sad. Like this whole situation wasn't sad enough already, but being a good Girl Scout of my local troop, I offered to give her a friendship bracelet I had made, but wouldn't take it. She couldn't even say why, but yet again, as soon as I mentioned it, a look of dread overcame her face. Just then, 2 older women, one almost gorilla-like in stature, and another thinner woman with blonde hair, both wearing pale and quilted-looking house dresses, shouted at her to get inside right this instant. None of us ever saw the family again. My parents seemed strangely relieved. About a year later, though, one day, my mum suddenly took to asking us really weird questions about them, like if we'd ever been over to their house, or if they offered to take us to their church services. I was 8 or 9 by then, and hated going to our own church. Why would I actually want to go to another one? My mum's persistence was worrying my dad, and one night, when the questions got particularly annoying, Dad took her aside, saying something like, "If they knew anything, don't you think they would have told someone or us by now? They're just little girls, they don't know." After the last batch of stock market tumbles in '89, we left Utah for good. It wasn't until the YFZ ranch raid in 2008 that I even remembered this ever happening. I called my parents after a few days of reflection, and, well, they're quite a bit older and don't remember everything quite so clearly as they once did. Yep, our neighbors were very likely members of a fundamentalist sect of Mormon ideology. Yes, I know full well that the mainstream LDS church no longer officially practices polygamy. After thinking about the situation some more and doing some light research on the origins and beliefs of the cult, the odds are good that their parents were followers of Warren Jeffs. Those poor kids didn't stand a chance in an environment like that, but at that age, I had no way of knowing. In 2011, I got an email from my mother, who had been casually chatting up our old Utah friends, the few relatively sane ones we had, and she told me that a girl who used to come over and play with us fairly regularly as a child had committed suicide a few weeks ago. Apparently, she was running away from her husband, and had been for some time. I pressed her for details, but my mum outright refuses, to this day, to tell me why she left him. Creepy cultist neighbors from Salt Lake City. Let's never meet again. More for your sake than mine.
Several years ago, when I was 25, I lived with my best friend at the time. Our friendship eventually started to dwindle, as it usually goes when you move in with a good friend, so she was rarely home. This night, however, she ended up staying up at our place, heading to bed early. I was a server at the time, so I stayed up pretty late, usually watching YouTube or smoking pot. This night was no different, except for the fact that my neighbors tried to take me. I'll go ahead and give you some background info on my house and my neighbors. We lived in a 3-bedroom house with 2 bedrooms and the kitchen facing the crazy neighbor. They were a younger couple living in a small mill house. They were constantly coming to our door and asking for handouts. Now, normally I'd be happy to help a neighbor out, but they would come over and ask for crazy stuff. For us to, fill up an old Mountain Dew bottle with water because theirs got shut off, beer, and once, literally, to ask for $1. They would constantly be knocking at our door to ask for help, and when we wouldn't answer, I'd peek through the window to see them either jacking cigarette butts from the ashtray or pressing their eyeballs against the door peephole to see if they could spot us. Anyway, there I was smoking some weed and watching YouTube on my couch when I heard a knock at the door. I rolled my eyes because I knew exactly who came a-knocking. It's 11 p.m. I checked the peephole and sure enough, the boyfriend was on my porch. Normally I'd just walk away and continue with my life, but he looked like he was in distress. I opened the door up to see what was up. "Hey, I just wanted to come over and see if you could film my engagement. I got my girlfriend a ring here in my pocket, and I need you to follow me to the backyard to film it for me." Baffled but curious, I told him congrats and said that I'd be out in a second and that I just needed to put my shoes on. I shut the door behind me and locked it. Quickly, I ran to the back room that looked out onto their backyard. I peeked through the blinds to see the setup. Nothing. Pitch black darkness. No sign of decoration or anything like that. Naturally, I woke up my roommate and told her what was going on. "Yeah, screw that," she said, and we both walked back up to the door after the boyfriend started banging on it. I looked through the peephole again and couldn't see anything, and I was confused all the way up until he pulled his eyeball away from the peephole. I quickly turned around and put my back against the door. My roommate came running back to the door from hers, manning 2 wire hangers for protection. We both clung onto the hangers and set up against the door until he finally left. We were so freaked out, but we wanted to make sure we were overreacting. We went out to our back door and hopped into her car so we could do a drive-by. as they always had their front door open and also didn't have any blinds, so it was easy to see into their house. Slowly we crept by in her car and peered into their living room. Sitting on the couch, and all staring at the wall, looking super strung out, was the couple and an older man. We sped off and ended up staying at a friend's house that night. I never answered the door for either of them again. One day I came home from work and an older lady was parked in their driveway. She walked up to me as I got out of my car and asked if I knew where the neighbors were. I told them I hadn't seen them for a while, and she informed me that she was the owner. She told me they were months late on rent and finally came to evict them. She entered the home to find it completely trashed. Needles, garbage everywhere, holes in the walls, and literal poop on the floor. I told her I was sorry to hear that she had to deal with all of that, but I was happy that they were finally gone. I'm not sure what was going on that night, but I'm glad that I didn't follow him into the backyard. My friend and I had a sneaking suspicion that he was going to take me, and that could have been the end of me. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so very much for listening. I really, really hope that you enjoyed tonight's stories. If of course you did, be sure to let me know in the usual way. And of course, if you enjoyed Deadly Cure's performance, be sure to show him some love by subscribing over to his channel too. You can find the link that will take you there on screen soon, as well as in the description. He really is exceptionally talented with that lovely voice. Alright then guys, well that's it from me. Of course, I'm also going to give a huge thank you to my amazing members and patrons whose names are on screen. You guys are the best. Thank you to everyone that keeps supporting the channel, it really does mean the world to me. But for now, stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.